Hello everybody, and welcome to the round glass review for the Nikon Micro-Nikkor 55mm f3.5 close-up, but not quite macro lens. This lens was made by Nikon. It was introduced in 1963 and later replaced in 1969, although the optical formula remained the same in the replacement lens. The typical lens uses for this primarily would include macro work, but macro lenses writ large also make great portrait lenses. As a 1:2 macro lens, this would also be very capable of general shooting and, point in fact, very many photographers with this lens used it as their general 50mm. Now to give you a really quick nickel tour of the entire video in just a few sentences, these lenses hold up today. Their optical quality and their construction quality were both fantastic. Given the price benefit of this lens versus the 2.8 version, and the fact that these perform just as well, if not better in very many cases, this lens is a solid option as a primary 50mm class lens, or as a close-up 50mm class lens. If you're a mirrorless shooter and pair this lens with a macro focusing adapter, you can carry something that is darn near or at 1:1 macro magnification on your camera and have it be a general use lens as well. Reciting here the instruction manual and some additional sources. The focal length and AOV for this lens are 55mm and 43 degrees diagonal on full frame, which on APS-C translates to 83mm and 28.8 degrees. The aperture range is 3.5 to 32 with a filter size of 52mm. As built, the closest focus is 0.241 meters, which in America is just shy of 2 times the diameter of the exhaust pipe on a stock Kenworth W900L. It's a manual focus only lens, available in Nikon F. I used it on Nikon F film cameras as well as Sony E mirrorless cameras. The lens size is 66mm by 64.5mm and it weighs in at a very svelte 245 grams. The best tip I have for you is that this lens is awesome on mirrorless cameras today, especially paired with a macro focusing adapter. That pairing lets you focus to or very nearly at 1:1 with no additional materials to carry around. For film camera users, Nikon recommends using Type B and E focusing screens for this lenses. Types A, L, J, KP, and R provide acceptable focusing ability with this lens, but the split prisms will go dark. Types G2 and H2 do not allow exposure metering. The balance of the focusing screen types have no recommendation in the instruction manual, meaning that they will work fine without negative effects on your ability to take photos. Nikon's manual notes that this lens performs optimally at 1:10 reproduction, which is a focus of 68 centimeters. That said, this lens also performs amazingly well across the entire range and at extreme magnification. As built, this lens focuses to 1:2, so strict macro terminologists will point out that this is a close-up lens, not a true macro lens with what it comes with. It can reach 1:1 with Nikon macro tubes M2 or PK3. Now those also adjust the metered aperture range from f/5.6 to f/45 when you mount those on the lens because they reduce the light level reaching the film or your sensor. That meter adjustment only has a real bearing if you shoot film, especially with an older camera and no TTL meter. Nikon designed this lens to be capable of reverse-mounted super macro work as well. Nikon bellows PB4 or PB5 and by extension reverse mounting adapters writ large allow this lens to be used for reproduction up to 4.3x, depending on the specific configuration. And that is a pretty significant amount of macro reproduction. Okay, so because this lens has some unique characteristics, we're going to add a section here that looks at how to take care of the exposure compensation and how to understand the lens's markings. First, the lens markings. Here's a series of photos that I stitched together, admittedly badly, of the markings around this lens, and it has some confusing markings. This lens specifically has simpler markings than some of the later versions. All the calculations that are going to be talked about are based on the helicoid position bands. That's my term for them. So when you align the bottom of your focusing ring with those bands, everything that aligns with your focusing ring at those placement bands applies. If you have no macro tube, you would use the appropriate markings, which are on the left side. And if you do have the macro tube, you would use the markings on the right. The aperture figures on the lens apply to the minimum aperture you will actually have when you set the aperture ring to f3.5, and the lens is focused at a point where the focusing helicoid reaches that line or dot. And this adjustment to your actual aperture is because of the reduced amount of image circle area as the focus racks, and also because as the focus is racked out, the light rays passing through the aperture become packed less effectively. So you're not just getting an effective aperture, you're also getting an actual aperture reduction. But in terms of depth of field, there's very little that's affected by depth of field by having that smaller aperture because of the macro distances that we're working at. When you calculate reproduction ratio exposure factors, this applies to magnifications from 1 to 10 to 1 to 2 using the lens's focus ring markings. For magnifications of 1 to 2 and greater, when the correct Nikon macro tube is installed, what you would use is the on-silver helicoid position bands and cross-reference that magnification rate against this table. The table here that I've reproduced from the Nikon manual shows the factor by which you need to multiply your exposure as well as the associated number of stops to increase your exposure. Now, since this exposure table really only applies to film camera shooters, for film users, all of the data you calculate with this table is pre-reciprocity failure data. This has a standard double gauze 5.4 design. It's very basic and also reliable. It appears to have been used also this design through each of the subsequent 55mm f3.5 lenses for the entire series run, which ended with the 1977 version of this lens. This good and simple lens design offers some significant benefits over other more complicated lens designs. Lower research cost, lower materials cost, reliable performance due to the simpler engineering, and also lightweight. This lens, by the way, it has all of those. And yes, the later 2.8 versions included corrections for up-close field curvature and aberrations that this lens did not have included in its design. However, this lens' smaller maximum aperture and the intended smaller working apertures of this lens do a lot to eliminate those issues. In real-life shooting, I didn't notice any issues with close-up field curvature or aberrations when I stopped this lens down, or even really in most situations wide open, and I shot this lens to a 1:1 magnification. Breathing is considerable even at close range with a short focus point change, as we can see in these examples of the full range from closest focus, or very nearly closest focus, to infinity, as well as a more natural video recording focus change of just about 1 meter. In all probability, breathing with this lens will limit or prevent its usability in video production. Exceptions would be for people learning to do videography or for close-up and macro video work where the focus isn't changing all that much. The aperture is stepped, but there are some Nikon f2 mirrorless adapters out there that have aperture control rings on them. If you shoot mirrorless video, getting one of those will let you treat this lens like a preset lens for video or even still use. The front element does not rotate, but it is not at all stationary and has a significant 29mm focus movement. The focus throw is about 295 degrees, which provides highly accurate focus control. The focus ring is wide, but does move in and out about 13mm. Focus and aperture ring damping will vary by your lens and the amount of use it's had over the last, 6 decades? On mine, there is very little damping, and this seems to have been a lens that the professional photographer who used to own it used the most, at least judging by the wear and the overall cosmetic condition compared to his other lenses. Sharpness on this lens is quite impressive, especially by 60 standards, and given the amount of abuse my lens specifically has had over the years and the small, fine scratches and dust inside the optics. Honestly, many of the photos I took with this lens looked to me like they were taken on a lens about 50 years younger than this one. And given that mirrorless cameras don't provide a significant benefit for fast aperture in terms of viewfinder illumination, for the photographer on a budget, this lens could be an exceptional option for macro work and, on crop sensors, portrait work. Build quality is exceptional and in line with professional-grade 60s Nikon gear. The contrast is flattish out of the camera and readily adjustable in post. Minor contrast enhancements in post make colors and contrast pop spectacularly with this lens. The aperture shape is hexagonal with 6 blades, and this leads to some very chaotic out-of-focus areas at times. More interestingly, some simply wild diffraction stars when you stop this lens down. I suspect that the diffraction stars exhibit strong secondary star points because of the way that the leaves on this lens align, and specifically the ways that the corners of the leaves, when the aperture stops down, meet. The design flaws are fairly minimal on this lens, which owes to how precisely macro lenses are engineered. The lens may well be optimized for 1:10 photography, as Nikon states, but it performs so well that I find it to be, of all the Nikon 50mm class lenses I've used, which is now 7 or 8 different designs and more than 20 specific lenses, to be the best. Both of the copies of this lens that I've owned have performed stunningly well. The balance with cameras with this lens is very good, even on light mirrorless cameras, and that's because it is, as we noted earlier, pretty svelte. Sometimes, old lenses have a sterility to their digital images, a deadness to the subjects and colors and scenes that doesn't exist on film. Often, old lenses perform better on film. That, however, is not the case with the Nikkor 55mm f3.5 micro lens. This lens comes alive in a way I've not often seen in vintage lenses when used on a digital camera. It works well on film, but if I'm honest, I like it more on digital, especially full-frame digital. I've heard that it's sharper than the 2.8, and I tend to believe it, having used both. It's also sharper than any of the 3 1.8, the 2 1.4, and the 1.2 lenses from Nikon that I've used. Honestly, if I had to choose just one Nikon 50mm class lens to use for the rest of my life, this would be the one. It's also lighter and cheaper than most of Nikon's other 50mm class lenses, and with mirrorless cameras, the speed loss from the 3.5 maximum aperture versus the comparable 2.8 lens is inconsequential. This lens is very possibly the best first ever macro lens a person can buy. It is also, very possibly, the best only ever macro lens a person could buy, at least in this focal length class. Nikon went to great lengths to make this an amazing and versatile lens. It shoots from infinity to 4.3x with some accessories, and can yield sharp and nicely contrasty or colorful images across that magnification range. The only real area where this lens does not excel is in live animal macro photography because the lens requires that you be too close for the insect or bird's comfort, and often they will fly away before you can photograph them. If you shoot micro four thirds, this would be a great portrait lens and could also serve as that insect macro lens too. This is a lens that holds up well and has great uses in every digital format from full frame and smaller. Some lenses can attempt to do everything. The Micro-Nikkor 55mm f3.5 can actually do almost anything and back that claim up with fairly amazing results.